regarding caregiving. And then that, and then we'll have a voice of God that says welcome.
The super loud voice.
Yes, exactly. And then once you're on stage, this clicker will advance your slides. Your slides will be down here for you to see, but you can also use this pointer. I'm not trying to blind anybody. Hi, Sid. How are you?
I'm just coming up here so you can tell me what I'm going to do wrong.
Sure. This will control your PowerPoint advancement.
It will, okay, because
Yes,
earlier
sir.
it seemed like it wasn't.
Is it the
doing
green
that.
button?
Those were
So-
pre-done though.
They
You have to
were,
tell me
some,
which button to
some
push.
of them were pre-done, and some of them were not.
Is it the green arrow?
Yes, ma'am.
To advance. And if we accidentally advance too far, that's the back. Okay.
Yes,
That's
ma'am.
all I need to know.
And if at any time anything is not going your way or not advancing, thank you. We're live on Facebook. If at any time you would try to advance and it's not advancing, you can talk directly to me and we'll advance for you. I'm Amy, so call at me if you need any help. Yes, with this component, right? Yeah.
See,
So,
thank you for that.
So you can use this to point if you'd like.
We have bright lights flickering. I'm like, laser pointer.
It's like
But I'm still the one to be like doing it on
It says no notes there.
this. It's like it's the little things.
Nice to meet you, by the way. Charlene Subnet is a good friend of mine, and she talks about you all the time. She said, I used to be at UT Southwestern. I'm not anymore. No, actually, I was one of I'm at tier. See where he's more than Herman and Houston.
Yeah, and sometimes it gets cut off.
That's fine.
I know it well.
And the care partner stuff. Stuff I've done. Project together, and then shit comes.
I apologize when I
No, I still haven't. I was just texting her. That's fine.
Good. Tell her I said hi.
But it's good to find you.
It's a pleasure to meet you. I'm going to get out of here for a second.
I'm sure it's going to pick you up and hear you wonderfully. And so you guys are kind of tag teaming your presentation.
Yeah,
is that
so
right?
I'll start and
you'll
then-
have different pieces that you say. Okay, wonderful, awesome. And if you need anything again, so just call it me if you need anything.
Okay, okay.
Thank you, ladies.
I'm gonna sit down here.
Everyone knows that dementia has a burden, makes a burden on caregivers, but we don't understand what it is how different caregivers experience that burden. So the kinds of things we're looking at are the intersection of public health, caregiving, technology. And that's because the problem is growing. The whole country is aging. Texas is also aging. So we're going to have to face the issue of more people with dementia. We need to understand how we can care for it, how we can care and support those people, whether they're healthcare professionals or family caregivers. That's another advantage of TARC. TARC is a state treasure. It is exactly what we need to move forward with dealing with dementia, Alzheimer's, and understanding for the future. It's given us the resources to be able to look at caregiving issues. It's given us the ability and the motivation to reach out to our sister institutions. So both in terms of funding our research, but also mobilizing a collaboration across the state. It's the synergy effect. It's the multiplication effect. So we may be expert around caregiving issues, but now we're partnering with Houston Methodist, and they look at clinical issues, or Texas Tech, where they look at more biomedical issues. So it enables you to bring your strengths to a table where there are other sort of legs that build the table and make it very strong. Every dollar that's put into TARC will help us understand the nature of disease, the nature of treatment and care. And that's going to save money, because right now we're spending billions of dollars on care for dementia. Without TARC, we're not going to be able to be where we need to be in the future.
Please welcome TARC Collaborative Grant awardees, Dr. Shannon Youngst and Dr. Kristen Wilmoth. Dr. Youngst is a clinical investigator and senior scientist at TIRR Memorial Hermann Brain Injury Research Center, as well as being adjunct associate professor at both UT Southwestern Medical Center and UT Health Houston. Dr. Youngst's overarching research program aims to improve the lives of individuals with neurological disorders and their care partners. Dr. Wilmoth is an assistant professor of psychiatry and physical medicine and rehabilitation at UT Southwestern. Her expertise is in the areas of clinical neuropsychology of cognitive and behavioral disorders and traumatic brain injury and concussion.
All right, quite the introduction. So I'm Kristen Wilmoth. I'm a neuropsychologist at UT Southwestern, working with Shannon, who will be presenting the latter half of this presentation. We are just thrilled to be recipients of the TARC-funded Collaborative Grant Initiative project, and ours is a care partner trial. So Care Partners in Dementia Problem-Solving Training is the English title of our project, and the Spanish title being Compañeros de Cuidado de Demencia Descubriendo Soluciones Juntas. To explain a little bit about our team, let's see. Go ahead and advance. Thanks. Oh, now it works. Okay, great. So as I mentioned already, we have Shannon Youngst and myself at UT Southwestern. We're one of the sites of this collaborative TARC grant. The other sites being UT Rio Grande Valley with Gladys Maestre and Texas A&M University with Matthew Smith. All right, and we have a wonderful team because this is not just done by us, that it's a large group that contributes to this research. We have interventionists, we have folks in the community, and we have other investigators that have been phenomenal in the Care Partner trial. So why am I calling it the Care Partner study or trial? Well, I think that it's really important that we think about how providing informal and unpaid care, not a professional caregiver, but those that are kind of pulled into this role for their loved ones, it's truly a partnership. It's something that impacts both parties. So that's why we're calling this the Care Partner study and not the Caregiver study. And it's an important concept here and why we're using this term throughout, because it really highlights the balance between the needs of the care recipient and the care provider. So if we fail to think of them as care partners, then we're missing the needs that the care partner has for themselves. And that's a really important thing that you probably have experienced yourself if you're maybe a parent or maybe even taking care of a pet, but that you're taking care of that living human being or living individual, and you've got to balance responsibilities to care for another and to care for yourself. And it's a really huge issue. So to give you a sense of the scope, if you take a look at the person to your left, to your right, immediately in front of you, behind you, chances are one of you is a care partner. That's because 53 million adults in the US, the equivalent of 1 in 5, provide this type of unpaid, non-professional care. And care partners have a great burden on them. They often assume the role without any advance warning. They receive little, if any, formal training in providing care, let alone training in coping with caregiver burden. So despite that, we know the burden of providing care can negatively impact their own health, the health of the care provider. And this is their physical and their mental health. And there are a lot of contributing factors to that caregiver burden, as you can see, or maybe that you've experienced yourself. So with this, well, we know a little bit about who might be at greater risk of caregiver burden. We've got past research that's identified there are some factors that we can use to predict care partner needs. One of which would be thinking about the individual's background, and that we have folks from Latin America typically spending more time and money, we noticed, than their non-Latino counterparts, which we think is in part, though it's hard to study, due to cultural factors. So concepts such as familismo, that there are ideas that are more collectivist culturally, placing then the needs of others or the group above your own. Hence why we perhaps see more time and money devoted when it's those individuals in the care partner role. But there are other factors too. We know that it depends on your relationship with the care recipient, that spouses are going to spend more time with their care recipient than perhaps maybe a child, an adult child that assumes that role. So it matters the relationship with the care recipient. It also matters about the care recipient's diagnosis. And our group saw that actually there were greater care demands placed on care providers for Lewy body dementia versus Alzheimer's disease, which we attributed to the neuropsychiatric challenges in this kind of static study. But when we look at it long term, we know that caregivers have to adapt, that dementia is a process that is going to worsen. And therefore, we're going to see that the care recipient's health needs will change, and that care partner has to adapt as the dementia progresses or as other health conditions present or worsen. Okay, so what is our solution for this? Our intervention is problem-solving training. Problem-solving training, or PST, is a self-management intervention. It teaches adaptive and proactive problem-solving skills, and it's basically the skills that are needed to make a good decision, to leverage internal and external factors, as well as to put plans into action. So PST in this way is a metacognitive strategy, and it's going to incorporate principles of cognitive rehabilitation. So in our study, we adapted this in a paradigm where it has a very easy to use A, B, C, D, E, F mnemonic for those steps of problem solving. They're steps that encourage the individual to assess their situation, to generate and choose solutions, to create action plans and follow through, and also to evaluate and revise their plans as needed. And what's especially powerful about an approach like this is that it doesn't matter what the problems are that the person wants to address. So it's not a problem-specific or a task-specific strategy. It's a cognitive strategy, and it's aimed to better equip the individual to cope with life's stressors. So it's not that we're teaching a strategy for a specific problem or population, but essentially a global strategy for how to be an active problem solver, no matter what problems come up. So, lots of strengths to PST. I'll just enumerate a few of them today. But we know that training care partners in PST can improve care partner and care recipient outcomes. So we know that it's effective. It can be incorporated rapidly into daily life, and the effects are maintained over time. Another strength of it, too, and how effective it is that it's going to reinforce the individual's own strengths. So if we think about parallels to other interventions, it's really going to be building that positive relationship and view that one has of themselves so that we can give our care partners a better sense of agency. It's also a really flexible approach, as I've described already. So it's pretty value neutral, it's pan-theoretical, and so in that way, it can be adapted to a wide variety of problems and situations and populations. The other thing, too, is how accessible it can be. So we can train interventionists to provide PST from a variety of professional backgrounds. So this could be, going back there. So this could be folks in nursing, folks in psychology, folks in medicine, folks from other rehab backgrounds that don't have to have a specific professional background, such as psychology, but they can be trained to become PST interventionists, making it more likely for an individual to have access to PST and more likely for hospitals and clinical settings to uptake these programs to give and provide individuals access to PST. Okay, so jumping ahead here, we see that there is a need for some PST cultural adaptation. And what we did for this study was created a Spanish language, culturally adapted problem-solving training intervention for care partners in dementia. And it preserved the original fundamental concepts of PST. So I'll explain that in just a moment. But first, I want to kind of state why we chose this group. We know that English-speaking care partners have better access to health services and research, frankly. However, individuals from a background from Latin America, Latina, Hispanic communities, they're a growing portion of care partners in dementia. And these are folks that typically report wanting access to non-English education materials related to providing care. So also we think about this as a group that not only spends more time typically and money in their care for their loved ones, but also they're a group that tends to be disadvantaged in their own health. So PST is so great because it's an intervention for that individual's own health too. So we're thinking about, kind of holistically that this is a person that we're treating that is related to the dementia, but not necessarily the individual themselves with the disease. And there is a great need for culturally adapted and culturally sensitive self-management interventions, particularly for individuals from Latin American backgrounds. And really few have been studied. On the screen there is a QR code. You can pull out your phone and take a look at a paper that our group published that in greater detail outlines the argument for why we need a culturally adapted PST. But briefly, it's really important to adapt PST, and we can. So we know that through adjustments to the linguistic register and lexicon, it can be possible. But it's not as simple as just translation. The other thing that is really great about translating a manualized program or intervention like PST is that we can maintain fidelity assessment. We know that it is manualized and it's given in a protocol-driven way, so folks in either language are getting the same intervention. Okay, so a little bit breaking down what PST actually looks like. And so again, it's this A, B, C, D, E, F mnemonic, but we adapted it for our Spanish language translation into DSJ, or Descubriendo Soluciones Juntos. As illustrated here, we're preserving that mnemonic with a couple of changes due to some linguistic components. So as an example, we wanted to avoid the use of anglicisms like brainstorming. Doesn't really translate into a B in the Spanish language. So instead we use buscar to get that sense of searching without using the term brainstorming. The other change that was more linguistically driven was collapsing the final 2 steps of PST into one E step. Also, though, it wasn't just linguistically making sure that terms lined up in the right steps. It was a much more intense process than that required feedback from the participants in the Spanish language participants themselves. Because there were things that we found like connotations around the words. So the term problem was not as effective and had a different connotation than it does in English. I think we have a kind of a positive sense of problem solving in English that just wasn't there. And so by instead looking at DSJ, we were able to kind of find these solutions together, discover solutions together, DSJ. And in that way, our Spanish-speaking participants were more likely to be able to pick out and search and find problems to use PST on. All right. And one last point before Shannon comes up is really just to say how important that piece is. that really, I know in my experience as a clinician, if I'm trying to use an assessment, whether it be cognitive assessment or an intervention, that this cultural adaptation piece, it really is an important takeaway for any of the providers in the audience, that you can't simply just have a translator or an interpreter and make good use of the same tools that we have, that we do have to do the work to culturally adapt them. All right, Shannon, turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'm shorter than Kristen. Okay. So thank you for providing that great foundation. Now I get to share with you the study that we designed and did, which is the CADES trial. I can't see over the podium to my slides, so I'm going to shift over here. So this was a randomized controlled optimization trial of PST and DSJ for both English and Spanish-speaking dementia care partners. And I want to take a moment just to talk about that optimization piece, because we know that PST is effective. There's a whole body of literature that shows it has efficacy for improving adaptive problem solving, depressive symptoms, and other mental health outcomes in a number of different clinical populations and in care partners across a number of clinical populations as well. And as Kristen said, it's condition neutral, so it really has the potential to be scaled up to a very broad scale and to be generalizable in settings across clinical populations and across settings. It has been delivered in person, over the telephone, and over video conferencing, so it has that adaptability as well. However, there is a gap in efficacy to implementation in real-world practice, and we know this, and so our hope was to try to bridge that gap. And one of the things that we need to know, especially for any intervention, but for behavioral interventions like this, are the details. So you find studies that say there's efficacy. When you actually go to deliver them, you start to run into problems. Who does this apply to? How many sessions? How long? Who should deliver it? And so we were hoping to really start to drill down and answer those questions. If you think about it as a parallel to like a pharmacological trial, you do really careful dosing studies to narrow down that dose. And that's essentially what we're doing here. It's just much more difficult to operationalize dose of a behavioral intervention than it is of something like a medication. So what we proposed was a randomized trial of 4 different versions of PST or DSJ. It was 3 or 6 session plus or minus boosters. So a person could get as little as 3 in-person sessions, and that was it, or face-to-face, not in-person. It was all done over video conferencing. Or 6 one-on-one sessions with 6 monthly boosters following that. across those 4 conditions. We enrolled 106 care partners of adults with dementia across 2 participating recruitment sites, although most of our recruitment did occur out in the community, and I'll talk about that in a bit. Recruitment has ended. We are just wrapping up active intervention sessions, and we'll be wrapping up our data collection later this summer. So the QR code in this case links to the protocol paper if you want details of the study protocol that is published, and it is registered also on clinicaltrials.gov. So our main specific aims were to compare the efficacy of 3 versus 6 session PST-DSJ with and without boosters, specifically for decreasing caregiver burden and depression, and also for looking at enhancing adaptive problem-solving skills, which is what we think the intervention is directly targeting. We had a secondary aim to identify key factors associated with that efficacy. So really the main point of this second aim was to say what works best and for whom. So there might not be one perfect combination of sessions and boosters for everyone. It might be that a different combination works differently for different people. And from our interventionists' experience in delivering the intervention, they found just that and have already started documenting situations where they felt that having more sessions would have been more helpful, or that a person was really doing well with fewer sessions. And we're also collecting information from our participants to that end. These are the inclusion criteria for the study. Care partners did have to express at least some level of depressive symptoms or caregiver burden on our screeners. And they had to be able to self-consent. So this was our minimum level of cognitive ability and inclusion. I'm not going to talk about it today, but we did collect a basic screener of cognition in our care partners, just because we know many of them are also aging themselves and may be dealing with their own cognitive decline. I have a list here of the various recruitment efforts, and I'll circle back to this to show you what was the most effective, but you can see that we used a lot of different approaches. It was combined approaches from physician referrals and clinics, to research registries, to community-based health events, to social media. Our original hope and plan was that we would be able to enroll enough English and Spanish-speaking participants to run all of our analyses in parallel. That didn't happen. We did end up meeting the necessary sample size to conduct all analyses, but just not to do it separate in English and Spanish speakers. This is a summary of our screening and consent process. You'll see that of all of the people we screened, 43% consented, and we had about 17% who were not eligible. This is a breakdown of the people who refused, so that 12% in the white part of the pie chart. These are the reasons that they refused. So you'll see the predominant reasons were not having enough time or feeling overwhelmed. This is something we anticipated, and there will probably always be people who are feeling too overwhelmed or don't have the time to commit to an intervention like this. You'll see also that there's a portion of people that didn't feel that they would benefit from the intervention. We don't know why that is necessarily, if they maybe didn't feel like they were struggling enough that they needed the help, or they didn't actually feel that the intervention itself would be helpful. I do want to note that bottom group, the 33% who are not interested in research, because if we're talking about implementation and scaling this up, that's an interesting group. I think that there might be people open to the intervention and to receiving the help who perhaps are just hesitant to participate in research and research studies. There's a lot of myths out there about research, and I think especially as we're trying to be more inclusive and to reach groups that have been historically underrepresented, some of the distrust of research is even more critical, and something that I think we really need to think about as we're trying to be more inclusive. This just summarizes our most successful recruitment sources. You'll see that physician referrals was very, very successful, and that's not surprising. We call this the warm handoff, that if you actually have somebody who has talked to the person that they have a relationship with and they make a direct referral, that really helps and goes a long way. Word of mouth was also pretty robust. So again, it includes, kind of that trusted person who passes this along. The just flyers and posts on social media direct emails were less effective, although not ineffective. And you'll see the community events, the 10% was pretty effective. I think all of us are aware of COVID. And so those community events were something that we had just started towards the end of our recruitment as these things were starting to happen again. And you'll see this is just summarizing across all of those, that overwhelmingly any recruitment efforts that had a direct interaction, so people actually talking, having a chance to ask questions, getting to know the person recruiting them, were much more effective than the without direct interaction, which included someone just clicking the link and completing the screening. Again, that's not terribly surprising, but it is important to keep in mind as we do more and more remote work. This is a summary of just the baseline characteristics of our participants. The pie graph shows you that almost all of our participants were either a spouse or partner or an adult child of the individual with dementia. And that's pretty split. So while our average age was 60 years, I don't think that that's actually a good representation, because we didn't have a normal distribution in ages of the care partners. And we do know from past literature that there are big differences in the experience of being a care partner for people who are adult children versus those who are spouses and partners. You'll see that our sample was predominantly white, European or Caucasian. That includes, that is race, not separating out ethnicity. So that does include our white Hispanic population in that number. We did have 27% of our sample was identified as Hispanic, which is pretty close to the national breakdown. We had a bit of a divide between those who were employed versus not, versus retired. We would imagine, and haven't looked at this yet, but that's going to track pretty closely with the adult child versus spouse. And then you'll see we had most of our care recipients had Alzheimer's disease, but there was a mix of diagnoses. Average years since diagnosis was 4 years, but there was a pretty good range there. So because we're talking about implementation and how these results are really going to allow us to scale this up, I think it's really important to look at some of the things outside of just clinical efficacy. Were we able to deliver the intervention? Did people like it? Did they, was there uptake? And this is something that our group was really particularly proud of, is that we had really excellent engagement and retention for the people who started our sessions. So to date, we've had 74% complete 100% of sessions as assigned. 25% have completed boosters as assigned, but if you look at the ones that are still in progress, there's still almost half of our sample are in progress for their boosters. If all of those complete sessions as assigned, we'll hit very nearly 80% of 100% completed sessions, which for a pretty intensive behavioral intervention is somewhat remarkable. And the booster sessions are also very high. We had a smaller number who just didn't complete all of their sessions. If they missed a session, some of them maybe did a number and then we just kind of lost them for the last session. But they did receive some intervention. We had a much smaller percentage that never started, and those are the folks that we just could never get a hold of after they'd kind of consented and completed baseline assessment. But those percentages are substantially lower than what we see across the literature in similar kinds of interventions. So looking at the actual sessions, we have delivered 417 total PST or DSJ sessions. I would say to date, but it's actually as of the end of December, so a few more since then. We measured engagement on a 1 to 6 point scale. It's the Pittsburgh Rehabilitation Participation Scale. The therapist rates it at every session. It's a very prescribed engagement scale that ranges from the participant did nothing to the participant led the session. They took charge and basically led the session would be a 6. And our average score across all sessions and all participants was a 5, which is very high. So our participants are engaged, they're taking charge, they're taking ownership, which is exactly what we're trying to do with this intervention. As Kristen said, the intent is to give them agency, to empower them to do this on their own, and that's what these scores are showing us. We use the CSQ-8 to measure participant satisfaction with the interventions, and it was very high on the participants who have completed it so far. We will have more numbers as the sessions end. So this is just the people who have completed all the interventions so far. We had the participants and the therapists rate a number of things after the last session. Their confidence in their understanding of how to use the strategy, their confidence in their ability to apply it after the sessions ended, so to go out into the world and do this on their own, and the number of sessions that they would have preferred, that they felt that they needed, regardless of what they were assigned. The therapist who led the session also rated their all of these things as well. And then we had our therapists rate their confidence in the delivery of the session. We've measured fidelity of all of a percentage of the sessions, but we wanted to see, as we're looking at factors that affect efficacy, maybe the therapist had a client, one of their participants that they just didn't connect with, and their confidence was really low. We'll be able to look at that to see if, to what extent that affects how much a person can benefit. You'll see overall on a 0 to 10 point scale, higher is better, that confidence in understanding and applying the strategy was very high, and that the number of sessions on average people would have preferred was 3. This is really consistent with past literature as well, and is encouraging to us that even if, given resources, it was only possible to deliver 3 sessions, that at least the participants feel like that would be beneficial. We have to see if the efficacy data holds up. Wanted to, before kind of wrapping up and concluding, take a minute to share our care partners' experiences with the intervention in their own words. So we do ask them at the end of the CSQ-8, the satisfaction assessment, if they have anything else they want to share about the intervention. And in going through the data that we have so far, I believe we had 48 people that we have this data on so far. Almost everybody actually said something, which was also surprising, because usually in those kind of open-ended you get a lot of blanks or none. And they said a lot. And I've put just a handful of quotes. I had so many to choose from, but there are 2 that I really want to highlight. The first one in the upper bubble there, the person said about the intervention, you pick it on an issue that is really close to your heart, something that you really want to do. That absolutely illustrates what Kristen was talking about earlier, about how this is flexible and is driven by the participants' own values, the things that they find important. So this really supports patient and family-centered approaches and kind of supporting value-based living. This also supports being culturally humble and culturally competent in the care that we deliver, because we're allowing the person's values, their own cultural values, their own whatever values, to really drive the process. And it was really neat for us to see that the participants, without prompting from us, were recognizing that and were sharing that with us. The other quote I just want to highlight is the one in blue. The person said, a lot of the times the answer is within you. You just need some type of something that's going to bring it out. And with this, being PST, that's what it did. The answer was already there. You just needed some type of structure, some type of plan to bring it out and not to be dependent on the person on the other end. So there's a lot in there that really speaks to what we believe are the active ingredients of this intervention. 1, we provide that structure. that step-by-step simple structure that helps people break things down and allows them to bring out those answers that are already there. Just helps them think it through and simplify it. And that this person recognized that they couldn't be dependent on the therapist to walk them through this, that this was not a therapist, directed intervention, but rather that the therapist was guiding them to be able to do this on their own, to give them that agency to do it when the person was not there on the other end. So just to wrap up some conclusions and some lessons learned so far, successful community outreach for research recruitment and we anticipate for implementation really requires direct interaction, whether that's face-to-face or over some kind of teleconferencing. You have to talk to a person. Our participants were highly satisfied and engaged. They perceived a benefit in the intervention. We haven't yet seen if there is a benefit to the clinical outcomes, depression and caregiver burden, but the fact that the participants perceive a benefit is a benefit already. PST and DSJ could be incorporated across clinical settings into existing education-based caregiver interventions to provide those problem-solving skills to put the education they learn into meaningful action. And it could be provided in the community through, for example, peer-led intervention, which is something we're exploring. But as Kristen also noted, we have a protocolized training for our interventionists, and the interventionists can come from a number of different backgrounds. You don't need doctoral level training. We've done this with a lot of master's level providers. We've had interventionists who have with high fidelity delivered the intervention after 1 year of master's level education training, so not even completing their education. So it really could be more easily scaled up. We could make adaptations to the delivery based on individual needs, abilities, and health perceptions. We hope that our results will inform adaptations based on some characteristics that we have measured. But in doing this, it's given us an understanding of how we could adapt the intervention to meet the person's needs, to meet that individual, while still maintaining the fidelity of the intervention that all of the evidence is based on. So I'm going to land on this slide, another QR code. This links to our, there's a link as well if the QR code doesn't work, but it links to a REDCap database where we have housed our resource guides. There's a number of guides here. Something that we developed as part of this collaboration, in addition to the PST, was a Texas Dementia Care Partner Resource Guide. It has 12 chapters that just go through information about being a care partner, addressing your own needs, what are the some common types of dementia. And then at the end, it has a number of different resources to all kinds of community-based services, how to get transportation things, how to get SNAP, how to connect with and navigate Medicare, Medicaid. So it's a really fantastic resource guide. And it's available. You can download it. You can use it. There's printed copies. Well, there's one example of a printed copy on the table if you want to flip through it. It's beautiful to print it out, and it's something that if anybody wants that resource, it's available. We also have a protocolized interventionist manual. I also have an example on the table there, plus the materials that we give participants. So it's ready to go. If somebody wanted to receive the training, we can provide that to deliver the intervention. And then lastly, I just want to circle back to where Kristen started and just really thank TARC again for supporting this work. I think for starting to incorporate care partners and their needs into the work the great work that's being done here is really important. It starts to round out the needs of the person with dementia as a more holistic person, an entity, and understanding that the people in your systems, those people in your support systems, have a really substantial effect on your health and you on theirs. I also just want to acknowledge what a fabulous experience the collaborative project was, that this truly was a unique collaboration, that we had investigators from public health backgrounds, from rehabilitation backgrounds, from neurology, from neuropsychology, social work, community outreach. It was truly a multidisciplinary team. Our group, we had a number of bilingual individuals, which was really important for informing the work that we were doing and the populations we were working with. And it just was a really unique opportunity that resulted in work that would not have otherwise occurred without that true collaboration. So just want to acknowledge my teammates and partners in this, and again, thank TARC.
We have a few minutes for questions. If anyone has a question, you can come up to the mic here or I can bring it to you. See any hands anywhere? Anybody? Come on. Y'all that tired? Do we need some more coffee? Okay. Thank you very much.
We know that with diseases like Alzheimer's disease, the course is so long and it's interacting with the person throughout their lifespan. And so you have biological components, you have social components, you have environmental components. And over time, there's also been a big appreciation in the value of large data sets, of having lots of individuals, because the outcomes that we care most about, those that are most clinically meaningful, such as cognition, they're messy variables. There's a lot of heterogeneity. And so to really be able to understand what we're seeing in the data and get reliable results, we need to work together. We need to share our data, and at the end of the day, that's how we get further. What's really unique about TARC is the diversity, that this is a cohort that is very much representative of Texas and all of its diversity. And we recognize what a unique resource this is, that there are so many large data sets where they don't have the same level of diversity. And with the funding from the TARC Hispanic Continuation Study, we've been able to follow a very large sample of individuals from diverse backgrounds. So the ability for us to leverage this really big resource that has all of these data points where people have been followed over time is really critical for addressing some of these questions as to what causes the disease. And it took a lot of work to get there, a lot of community engagement, and TARC has done a much better job of that than a lot of cohorts throughout the nation. And so for that reason, I think it's really important.
Please welcome Dr. Sid O'Brien. Dr. O'Brien is the Dr. Joe and Peggy Schooler Endowed Chair Professor of Family Medicine in the Texas College of Osteopathic Medicine and Executive Director of the Institute for Translational Research at the University of North Texas Health Science Center. He is the PI of the Health and Aging Brain Study, Health Disparities, the most comprehensive study of Alzheimer's biomarkers across diverse populations ever conducted.
Can I go now? I hear the VOG and I don't know when I'm supposed to start or stop. The voice of God has spoken. I've never heard that the media people know what that's called. Every time I hear it, it startles me. Okay, so first, thank you. It's great to see all of you again. Haven't been here in a while. You know, everybody's been, locked down, so it's great to see everybody in person. And I was talking to Monroe earlier about, I've been fortunate. I was one of the first people involved in TARC in the establishment of the original methods and protocols and cohorts, and as was Laura and Valerie and many others that are still actively involved. And what I've seen today, and Monroe and I were talking about, is just amazing, because when TARC first formed, there were amazing scientists in Texas doing Alzheimer's research. There just weren't a lot of scientists in Texas doing Alzheimer's research, which is actually one of the, Mark was recruited very shortly thereafter, and then Gladys and Shuda both coming to Texas and bringing very well-established scientists into Texas. And then since then, we have had many junior investigators, Stephanie, Allie, Lewis. I mean, there's so many of you that have done such wonderful jobs, and it's really nice to see the breadth of science that's going on in TARC these days, and also just looking around the room. I was at a conference just this week, and the diversity in that room versus the diversity in this room are very, very different. And so it's just very nice to see. So I'm going to talk to you today about the HABS-HD study. It's health and aging brain study among health disparities. And so one of the key things and the main reason I'm here today isn't really to talk about the science in the study itself. I'm primarily here today to talk about collaboration. This is an enormous project, an enormous infrastructure with large-scale data, and it's housed right here in Texas. And the goal, what I'm hoping, is to see and foster more studies of cross-collaboration, and Stephanie and I have talked about that, which is actually one of the reasons we reached out to Monroe, of people are now wanting to use HD data, TARC data for cross-comparisons, cross-validations, same with ADNI and others, and so there's tremendous opportunities here for growth in the scientific community. My disclosures, grants and biotech. This is the most important slide that I have in any of my talks. These are the people who actually do the work. I don't do anything. I am blessed to be part of a team that does amazing things. And I want to highlight a few people that my bolded component didn't come out, but Dr. Lee Johnson, Dr. Robert Rissman, Christine Yaffe, and Arthur Toga, who are all MPIs of this study and all very good friends of mine. This list is also only the people in my institute. So Christine and I were talking today that we need several slides because there's 17 institutions involved in this study, and these are just the ones at the Institute for Translational Research, and this is actually an underrepresentation. I think we're right around 80 full-time people now working primarily on this study. So, why? That's the question that I think oftentimes, interestingly enough, I still get asked, is why? Why is it that we need to study health disparities in Alzheimer's disease? And a lot of people still don't realize how much the health disparities that exist. And with the recent advancements and recent approvals, the health disparities will get bigger, not smaller, because of access. African Americans currently suffer the largest burden of Alzheimer's and Alzheimer's-related dementias, with almost a twofold increased risk, with Hispanics experiencing a 1.5 increased risk for AD and ADRDs. But also what a lot of folks don't realize is that the Hispanic community in the United States is also the most rapidly aging segment of the population, meaning that the fastest growth in Alzheimer's disease and the related dementias in this country will be among the Hispanic community over the next several decades. But there are components to this that it's not just about disease burden. There's also components about access. There's research to show that individuals from underserved communities are oftentimes diagnosed at a later stage in the disease, diagnosed with more severe pathology, more likely to be diagnosed with affective conditions, and oftentimes get misdiagnosed with affective conditions instead of the underlying neurodegenerative condition. Also, there's research to suggest that individuals from underrepresented communities live longer with the disease and increased healthcare cost and burden. Now, that is in contrast to the current literature and the state of the science of Alzheimer's in this country, with 90% or more of individuals enrolled in research in this country in Alzheimer's disease have been non-Hispanic white. Less than 5% oftentimes in clinical trials have been from underserved communities. However, as Ron clearly articulated this morning, there have been revolutions in this field in the last just decade, if not much less the last 2 decades, with the advancement of these biomarker capacities to look in living people to see not only the earliest symptoms of these pathology, but to see the progression of the pathology in those without cognitive deficits. That led to the 2018 ATN framework that Ron described, and that is now being revisited for a variety of things, including potential expansion. And one of the concerns that some of us have is that by 2050, this country will be not 50% non-Hispanic white. The majority of this country will be from underserved currently communities. So that this 2018 framework, does it apply across populations? And some people have argued over the years that Alzheimer's disease is not impacted by race and ethnicity, to which I say, please read in the cancer space, the diabetes space, the heart disease space, let's see, the HIV space, the hepatitis C space, and whatever other space you want to read that isn't brain disease. Because in the neurodegenerative space, it's in topic area we have not investigated due to an assumption that was wrong. So, but with the change in the landscape in the last few years, some of these things have become more clinically relevant, not just from a clinical diagnostic standpoint, but when one thinks of these advanced biomarkers that are now available in clinic and in clinical use. And it's no longer just lumbar punctures that are available to the select few who are, one, willing to do it and two, have the means to pay for it, but also now there are scans available, both amyloid and tau PET scans, FDA regulatory approved. There are now plasma biomarkers that are available. However, there are no appropriate use criteria for many of these biomarkers, especially the plasma biomarkers. As a matter of fact, very few of these have a context of use clearly defined for use. However, additional to that is very few of these studies, include imaging, plasma, whatever, CSF, have looked at these markers across diverse populations. The literature that has been out there is pretty clear that there are absolutely differences. Now, those differences exist across modalities. Why Texas? Why DFW, where I'm at, as a location for doing this? And this is something that Lewis and I were talking about earlier. Many people don't realize, even when I was talking to the NIA program about this submission, I got, well, you know, can they even recruit this many people in Dallas-Fort Worth? So people didn't realize, a lot of people don't realize there's 7 million people in the Dallas-Fort Worth metroplex. It is the 7th largest metropolitan area in the United States. However, this community in Dallas-Fort Worth, but Texas more broadly, already is reflective of the demographic characteristics of the United States by 2050. So where this country is moving in terms of demographics, this state, this community is already there. It makes us the ideal location to do this sort of work. And, you know, with this particular audience, you know, I know sometimes there are community members that come to this, to the TARC symposium. So I am going to cover a little bit of basics. There's some of you, I'm going to blow through them pretty quickly because I know for most of you this is not really something that is, you don't know, but basically Alzheimer's disease from the ATN framework. Some people don't know that ATN stands for amyloid tau neurodegeneration. If you saw Ron's talk, then now you know. So basically all this is, you know, aligns with the neuropathological characteristics that people have been studying for a very long time. But I think one of the things that gets missed is this component right here of the ATN framework, such that with this research framework, Alzheimer's disease now is amyloid. One cannot have the designation of Alzheimer's disease in the absence of amyloid. And so even A positive, T negative, you're still on the Alzheimer's continuum itself. So biologically, the field took that stance Now, that raises some very interesting dilemma when you work in a setting such that I do, where, and we had this discussion recently, and I would love for some input of how to deal with this, because clinicians are still using clinical parameters and guidelines. Advanced lumbar punctures and PET scans are available to basically nobody. 95% of patients diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease are diagnosed, treated, and followed in primary care. They never see a specialist at any level. And so that means the diagnoses are oftentimes wrong, but they're also using clinical parameters in the absence of biomarkers. And so I run a community-based study, so people come in with diagnoses from the community. And we do see people coming in with a clinical diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. We do the cognitive testing and everything, and they look like Alzheimer's disease, and then they're amyloid negative. And so then it becomes, how do we explain that? Because we give back the results. So how do we then sit with these families and say, well, it's not that your doctor was wrong, because many of these, we've seen the reports, they did wonderful examinations. They just use the clinical criteria that simply don't have this available. And so there's kind of an interesting space in the field right now where there's an absolute gap between the cutting edge research criteria for the assignment of the disease itself and the clinical that's being used every day across this entire country in every clinic everywhere who sees patients. So I don't know how. I asked Ron, and he said he would fix it. So by another week or two, Ron will fix that, because it's beyond me. This is just some of the imaging components that everybody has seen an amyloid and a tau scan, and so you get amyloid tau. This is kind of a classic ATN positive, and then amyloid and positive tau, and neurodegeneration negative. So here's where we're going to get to. So the Health and Aging Brain Study, Health Disparities, HABS-HD, formerly ABLE, Health and Aging Brain Among Latino Elders. The study's always been Health and Aging Brain Study, Health Disparities. We have been doing targeted outreach to diverse communities for a very, very, very long time. And so ABLE is and was the targeted outreach to the Hispanic community, just like the Black Alzheimer's Brain Study was the outreach to the Black community. And so if any of you live in anywhere around Dallas-Fort Worth or anywhere in the country that listens to a specific radio station, you have heard about our study because they still play it on the radio. Now, this program, it's basically multi-ethnic community-based ADNI. So think of that. We are asking. So with the recent renewal, well, it's a new grant, so it's not a renewal, but the recent funding and expansion of the cohort, we had already enrolled over 1,000 Hispanics and 1,000 non-Hispanic whites. We had also already secured additional funding to enroll 1,000 African Americans. So at this point, we've enrolled over 1,000 Hispanics and over 800 African Americans, and over 1,000 non-Hispanic whites. We originally began enrollment of only Mexican American into the study because 65% of the U.S. Hispanic population is of Mexican origin and 80% of the Texas population. However, with feedback from our own community, we realized that that was not the best approach. So we have now opened the recruitment to any Hispanic origin with the goal of reflecting Texas. So at current, we're trying to stay around 80% Mexican American, but with current immigration patterns and other things, most people actually don't think 80% Mexican American in Texas anymore. It's probably closer to 60. So we'll, but that's kind of, we're always in flux, and we try to flex to the community's needs. We have already completed visit 1. We have over 1,200 in with phase 2 visits. We're approximately 24 months apart with a longitudinal community-based cohort. There's no ever stop. No one ever, people can say no at this time point and then come in at a later time point. And then COVID obviously threw a big wrench into follow-ups. However, we're still moving along quite well. We do a detailed functional exam, clinical labs at Quest. We do sociocultural, environmental, a full interview, cognitive assessments. The biorepository is now over 1 million aliquots, 3T MRI, amyloid, and tau PET. With the new grant, we are adding multi-level systems biology, so we'll do whole genome sequencing, GWAS, methylation, targeted and untargeted proteomics, targeted and targeted metabolomics, exosomes, and Nicole's doing some transcriptomics. So Bob has a grant doing methylation and so added those components as well. So it's very comprehensive and very robust. This is the structure of the study itself. I am contact PI and run the administrative core. Dr. Arthur Toga and Meredith Brasky run the imaging core. I run the clinical core with Christine and Lee Johnson, Robert Rissman, the omics core with Mark Mapstone, Lee Johnson, Michelle Milkey, Carl Hill from the Alzheimer's Association Disparities and Outreach Core, Rima Rahman from Atiri, Ray Palmer from San Antonio, the Biostatistics Core, and Oziyama and Monica run the development core. And so that's what I said, 17 institutions. It's a rather large entity. I'm going to cover a little bit about some of the data, and then we'll cover some of the other components. So kind of what got us going in this, back actually in TARC, we started studying this, and what we found was an earlier age of onset of mild cognitive impairment among Hispanics compared to non-Hispanic whites by a pretty significant age gap, and we've subsequently cross-validated that in the HD cohort. And so at first, as a neuropsychologist, my first thought is test bias. The tests are messed up. However, we also had created local norms. Everyone involved in the consensus reviews have been doing this for at least 15 years with diverse communities. And so I thought probably not, something else might be going on. So we started looking into the different biological factors. Obviously, ApoE4 would be the #1 place to start. We were one of the earlier ones to identify this. Hector Gonzalez has cross-validated, as have others, that we see no matter how you slice the pie, lower rates of ApoE4 positivity among Mexican Americans as compared to non-Hispanic whites. Hector showed in Sol Inca that among different Hispanic communities, the prevalence rates of ApoE4 also vary. But there's a 1999 or 90 earlier article that actually looks at ApoE4 frequency across the entire globe. And what you see is, I mean, we've known for a very long time that ApoE4 fluctuates pretty drastically. We also have data now showing that ApoE2 is less common among our Mexican American participants. Mohammed, student, DO PhD student, showed some of this data. He's working on it. And this is just us pulling from the GWAS data some of the more established genetic risk factors. This isn't us identifying those. This is from the Kunkel article, some of the top ones, just looking at the frequency of risk alleles. And so basically what we found is a variety of things: younger age of onset, lower rates of ApoE4, and different changes in genetics. So one of the questions I get all the time, and now we have answers to, is amyloid. What about brain amyloid? Well, you can slice the pie anywhere you want it. We've looked at it in 3 separate studies so far. Amyloid positivity, yes, no, is lower among Hispanics and African Americans compared to non-Hispanic whites, whether you're looking at the A4 study. We did the ADPC study is one we've done. It hasn't been published yet, but that's the first ever study to actually look at a blood test screener in primary care. And so lower there. Same thing in HD, Hable HD. And Hable HD. I still say Hable. It's just kind of stuck with me for the last 10 years. All right, well, lower rates of ApoE4 and lower rates of amyloid, but given the literature, is ApoE4 related to amyloid burden when it's present? And the answer is yes. So even though ApoE4 is less common, amyloid positivity rates less common, in the presence of ApoE4, it is absolutely still related to brain amyloid, although the effect size is lower. But it is still significantly related to brain amyloid. So that's amyloid. What about neurodegeneration? This one was very interesting to me because it potentially lends into some explanations of things that we're finding, and that is we found that neurodegeneration positivity, this is based on the Cliff-Jack meta ROI. So there's different ways you can do some sort of, Alzheimer's cortical signature. This is just one. But what we found is the age of N positivity is younger among Hispanics as compared to non-Hispanic whites. With that age gap very closely mirrors the younger age of cognitive loss. Now, that's in the absence of lower, it's in lower rates of amyloid positivity. So what to me this is suggesting is those individuals are being clinically diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. I think we're seeing real pathology, but non-amyloid pathology. So there's something going on causing neurodegeneration, which could be due to long-term chronic diabetes, hypertension, and other things. This one, we're working on a publication on this one. Now, this basically is just saying that it doesn't really matter A, T, or N, however you slice it, whether it's group or by cognitive rates, cognitive diagnosis, that the positivity rates vary. Now, this one, the T positivity, many of you know, there's no global standards for positivity of tau. So this is based on Beth Moromino's article and how she did it. Our data is part of the consortium now combining tau data for creating a Syndeloid-like for tau, so hopefully that will help with those things as well. This particular slide I found interesting because Bruce and I, Miller, were talking years ago because when we saw that neurodegeneration thing, we didn't have the amyloid yet, but ApoE4, he actually said he thought we were probably finding more tau-mediated something going on in the Hispanic cohort. And what you see here is a different presentation pattern of tau in a 83-year-old non-Hispanic white male on the bottom and a 63-year-old Mexican-American female on top. And so we actually have a group that just downloaded the data, and that's one of the things they're looking at is just the pattern of tau and amyloid and how do these things vary across groups, and that's one of the key foci of the project itself. And so, you know, this thing, I should have said it because I say it oftentimes, is I'm going to raise more questions than I'm going to provide answers. That is the thing. That's the one thing I can be positive about. Because every time we peel back one layer of this onion, something else pops up. And there's a different slide that I don't think's in this particular one that popped up because we just ran the analyses of some of these novel plasma biomarkers of A beta 4042, p-tau 181, NFL, et cetera, to look at amyloid positivity. The relative importance of those markers for predicting amyloid positivity completely changed by race and ethnicity. And as a matter of fact, the one that was most consistently across the top was p-tau 181. NFL went from top to bottom. And so p-tau 181 so far, and Kai and I were talking about this the other day, is it looks like that one might be more consistent, but the levels also vary. And so the relative levels change. And this one, I love that one because I'll never understand the brain. So the genetics of those markers, and many of you know way more about the genetics than I could possibly get into. One of the things that I did not realize until I started digging more deeply into some of the top genetic markers, and some of them I knew, ApoE4, for example, covers so many different biological systems, it's kind of crazy. But almost all of the markers, the genetic markers that are top when you pull up the clinical article, cover and hit vascular, metabolic, and inflammatory pathways. Some of them hit all three, which is why in our project we're proposing an ATM-VMI model so that we can better encapsulate what we think probably is the pathology across groups. There's also recent literature, and many of you will know a lot more about this than I do, about the impact of vascular pathology on tau and how tau spreads in the brain. So this could be of tremendous importance. And this is one that we wanted to start looking at clinical outcomes. How do these markers differentially relate to the clinical outcomes? And ApoE4, the neuropsychologists in here will know that the literature on the link between ApoE4 and cognition is like it's related to everything, right? ApoE4, if it's present, seems to be related to poor memory, working memory, executive functioning, if you can wake up and brush your teeth, whatever. Among Hispanics, Mexican Americans, what we found is it is very specifically related to memory, which also, again, links back to that whole amyloid positivity, amyloid burden thing we mentioned a little while ago. However, one of the things we've seen, and Ron adequately addressed, and it's been a critique of the field, although the recent drugs address a lot better than some of the earlier drugs about how much amyloid is removed, but amyloid doesn't track well with cognition. I can't say it any other way, that's just what the data holds. Or does it? And so we then split the analysis up by race and ethnicity, and what we found is that among non-Hispanic whites, just like everyone else has found, amyloid doesn't really relate to cognition very well. If you had a larger, now these aren't small, so for us this is a small sample size, all right? When you're looking at 3,000, 4,000 people, for us 200 is a small sample size, but that's 200 people with an amyloid PET scan in one group. And so among African Americans, what we found, this was data presented at AIC, I believe, was that among African Americans, amyloid actually was related to cognition, which was something that we kind of didn't expect. And then when you flip it and look at tau is more strongly related to cognition among Hispanics, which is also suggestive of what Bruce was getting at. We may be seeing more tau-mediated stuff, which could also be interrelated to the neurodegeneration. But again, among non-Hispanic whites, not a lot there. So the link, so not only do the prevalence rates vary, but the link between these markers and clinical outcomes also seems to vary. So I think they're all important, but it's the relative weights. Now, why the relative weights change is likely, in my opinion, due to a lot of the medical comorbidities. And I think that's something we're going to dig a lot into. Speaking of medical comorbidities, Michelle Milkey published recently that these medical comorbidities impact plasma biomarkers, which hasn't really been thought about. Is if you have diabetes, how does it impact plasma amyloid? Well, the reality is it does. Here, what you see is these aren't yes, no, these are the objective measures. And basically, plasma measures of A, T, and N are related to a broad range of medical comorbidities. As a matter of fact, what Michelle has been looking at, and we haven't published it yet, but subclinical kidney issues it profoundly impacts these plasma markers. So just something that people need to think about. And then even just the raw levels of these markers vary between groups. Plasma amyloid, plasma tau, NFL. So they're varying between groups. We don't exactly know why. So we know that these medical comorbidities, though, also impact the markers themselves, and there's a differential prevalence rate of the medical comorbidities. This one is, and then I'm going to kind of wrap up, but this is one of those slides that was kind of an aha and no kidding sort of thing all at the same moment for me. So these are ADIs. So the ADI is broken. Amy normally does them in quintiles, comes out as a decile score. But what you look here and what you see is, so an ADI of 1 is least deprivation, neighborhood deprivation. ADI 5 is most. So what you see here are mirror images of one another. Okay, and so, okay, fine, this isn't anything new, but look at the table next to it. Even when you match by ADI, you still see differences in education and income. So living in the same area does not mean equal access to resources. So even though we may match and think this geographic region, which is now somehow homogeneous, no, it's not. And ADIs are related to cognition and a broad range of things. And so I put too many data slides in here because I want to talk about this too. So basically, our data now is saying that imaging and plasma markers vary between Hispanic, African American, and non-Hispanic white. It doesn't matter if you're looking at amyloid tau or neurodegeneration. The same goes for plasma. Now, before anyone asks, no, we don't have CSF yet, but we are actually starting a CSF sub-study. So we will be capturing cerebrospinal fluid, and we're yoking. So we will not, so anytime a non-Hispanic white participant comes into the study, we must enroll a Hispanic and African American, or no other non-Hispanic whites come into the study. And so we will stop enrollments. We will not allow an imbalance because, as Mark and others know, another biorepository full of non-Hispanic whites really doesn't add a lot to the field ADNI can do that and do it better than us. So that's what we're doing with at the moment, which is a huge undertaking given the fact that our focus groups yielded a 10% agreement rate. Oh, 10% were interviewed by me. Every single person that said yes was interviewed personally by me, and every single one of them went back to the team and said, that was Dr. O'Brien. We said yes, but no, we won't do it. So we have a steep hill to climb. Now, one of the things that I feel very passionate about, Monroe and I have talked about this, is this component. 100% data access availability to the scientific community. It's already available. Every 6 months we download a new database. All of the data is available at the item level. The scans are, raw scans are available if you want them. You can have them, download them. If you generate new data, you must put your data back in the database for the scientific community to have access to. If you get a grant, Bob Barber has a very nice R01 on methylation, you get a grace period. So your data can be embargoed so that you still have time to do your research. You don't get scooped. We're not trying to hurt investigators and their careers. However, once that embargo period is over, your data is in the database. You have absolutely no control over it. Everyone has access to it. And guess what? You don't even get to be on all the publications. So it's just available. We always encourage investigators to work with, we always will, this person's an expert here, you may want to get them involved. We encourage people to not do a kitchen sink approach because we're actually trying to track use of the data. But it's available. We've already given out since January over 150 databases. We've supported 6 training grants funded so far, 6 funded training grants, and I think 6 or 7 independent NIH R01 level grants. And so what I'm hoping is all of you will download the data, use it. If you're junior and you need a mentor, just find a mentor. You can't, as a student, you have to have a mentor. If you can't find a mentor, reach out to me and I'll help you find a mentor. We do have a development core now. Allie Clark at UT is our first cohort. She is the faculty member. We also have a student, graduate student, postdoc, faculty member in every cohort. So next year, any of you interested, please apply. I'm over my time. I'm going to stop and shut up because I'm between you and happy hour. So thank you for your time.
Maybe we can ask Dr. O'Brien to hang out for a few minutes if individuals have questions. There is one more series of announcements. We have poster winners about to be announced, but I just first want to thank everybody for coming. I hope this has been a rewarding experience. I've certainly learned a lot, and it's been so cool to see so many of our junior investigators presenting their work and the outcomes of TARC-related funding coming to fruition. So that's really cool. We plan to keep doing these meetings with the refunding of TARC, so we're excited about that. I'm going to bring Dr. Morales up for the final closing comments and the announcement of the poster award winners.
All right. So, well, thank you for staying until the last time of the symposium. I think that it was a great experience for all of us. Nice to see people coming, keep coming over the years and new people coming, so that's great. I hope to see you for the next symposium. And well, I will announce the winners. So we have 3 different categories. The first one is for the best student, and the best student was for poster number 2, presenting author Daniel Jemison from UTMB Galveston. Yes, I have nothing to give now, so if you can wave and say thank you. But I think that we will contact you later, but if you can, so people know you. All right. Okay. So now for the best young investigator, we have poster number 30. The presenting author is Haiyang Yu from UT Southwestern. And in the last category, the best TARC investigator is for poster number 8. Presenting author Isabel Gorham from University of North Texas Health Science Center. So with that, we conclude this symposium. Thank you very much for attending.